Maya Jenkins was no stranger to tense situations. As a covert operative for the CIA, she had faced some of the most dangerous missions in her career, from infiltrating war zones to dismantling criminal networks. But after years of living on the edge, she had finally returned home to a quiet, suburban neighborhood, a far cry from the chaos of her usual assignments. Tonight, she hoped for nothing more than a moment of peace, a chance to blend into normalcy and let the adrenaline of her past assignments fade away. She wore no badge of authority, carried no weapon, and kept her identity buried beneath layers of casual anonymity. Dressed in simple jeans, a leather jacket, and sneakers, she looked like anyone else out for an evening walk. But beneath her composed exterior lay the finely tuned instincts of a professional, alert to every movement, every shadow, every anomaly in her surroundings. The town itself was quiet, the kind of place where streetlights flickered lazily over empty sidewalks, and the only sounds were the distant hum of passing cars or the rustling of leaves in the cool night breeze. Maya had chosen this neighborhood for its tranquility, its detachment from the chaos of the city. It was a place where people still nodded at strangers and small talk flourished in the local diners. But for all its charm, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that some things in this town weren't as perfect as they seemed. She had noticed it in the fleeting glances from certain neighbors, the way conversations would sometimes falter when she entered a room. She had experienced enough in her life to recognize subtle prejudice when she saw it. As she walked along a dimly lit street, Maya focused on the rhythm of her steps, her breathing steady, her senses scanning the environment out of habit. The street was lined with modest houses, their porches adorned with warm lights and carefully tended plants. Some windows glowed with the blue flicker of televisions, while others were dark, their inhabitants likely already in bed. For Maya, this was a chance to reconnect with herself, to feel human again after years of wearing different identities and operating in high-stakes environments where the margin for error was razor-thin. Unbeknownst to her, Officer Todd Hale was patrolling the area in his squad car, his mood sour and his mind clouded with resentment. Todd had been with the force for a decade, but his career had plateaued. He had once dreamed of being a detective, of making a name for himself as someone who could clean up the streets. Instead, he found himself stuck on routine patrols, his disciplinary record stained by accusations of misconduct. To him, every slow night was a reminder of his unfulfilled ambitions, and every pedestrian was a potential problem waiting to happen. Todd's worldview had been shaped by years of frustration, and his biases had hardened into an unspoken mantra: certain people didn't belong in certain places, and it was his job to remind them of that. Tonight, as he drove through the quiet streets, Todd's gaze fell on Maya. To him, she didn't look like she belonged here. It wasn't just her skin color, though that was part of it. It was her confident stride, her calm demeanor, the way she carried herself. It irked him in a way he couldn't fully articulate, but he didn't need to. Years of unchecked authority had taught him that suspicion was justification enough. He slowed his car, watching her for a moment before deciding to act. This would be his chance to assert control, to feel the power that had eluded him in so many other areas of his life. Maya noticed the car before she heard it, her instincts kicking in as the subtle glow of headlights illuminated the street behind her. She didn't react immediately, instead continuing her pace, letting the vehicle come closer. She had learned long ago not to overreact, to let the situation develop before making her move. As the car crept closer and slowed to match her speed, she glanced sideways, catching the unmistakable shape of a police cruiser. The officer inside hadn't yet rolled down his window, but Maya could feel his eyes on her, scrutinizing her every move. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was this a routine patrol, or had she somehow drawn his attention? She had been careful to stay low profile since returning home, avoiding anything that might raise questions. But even in her casual attire, she knew she couldn't escape the biases that often followed her. She slowed her steps slightly, adjusting her breathing, readying herself for whatever might come next. The car rolled to a stop a few feet ahead of her, and the driver's side door opened with a creak. Out stepped Todd, his hand resting casually on his belt, his posture oozing an air of authority that felt more menacing than reassuring. "Evening," he said, his tone sharp and clipped, more command than greeting. Maya stopped, turning to face him with an expression of calm neutrality. She had dealt with people like him before, men who used their position to intimidate, to assert dominance. She knew better than to escalate the situation, but she also wouldn't let herself be cornered. "Good evening, officer," she replied, her voice steady and polite. "Is there something I can help you with?" Todd's eyes narrowed as he studied her, searching for anything that could validate the suspicion brewing in his mind. "You live around here?" he asked, his tone carrying an edge that made it clear the question wasn't casual. Maya tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady but non-confrontational. "I do," she said simply. She didn't elaborate, knowing that giving too much information could be as dangerous as giving too little. Todd stepped closer, his hand still hovering near his belt. "Strange time to be out for a walk," he said, his voice thick with implication. "Most people are home by now." Maya felt the tension building, the air between them charged with unspoken hostility. "It's a quiet neighborhood," she said, keeping her tone even. "I thought I'd enjoy the peace and quiet before calling it a night." Her calmness only seemed to irritate him further. Todd's grip on his belt tightened as he leaned in slightly. "You know, this area's had some trouble lately," he said. "Break-ins, vandalism, people hanging around where they don't belong." Maya met his gaze, her expression unchanging. "I'm just out for a walk, officer. I'm not looking for any trouble." Todd smirked, though there was no humor in it. "Funny thing about trouble, it usually finds you when you least expect it." Maya's heart rate remained steady, but her mind was already running through contingencies. She could see where this was headed, and she knew she had to tread carefully. Todd was looking for a reason, any reason, to escalate the situation. She had dealt with men like him in far more dangerous circumstances, but that didn't make this encounter any less fraught with risk. The silence stretched between them, heavy and oppressive. Todd took another step closer, his presence looming. "Why don't you tell me exactly where you're headed?" he said, his voice dropping to a lower, more menacing register. Maya didn't flinch, her voice calm and firm. "I'm just trying to get home, officer. That's all." For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet street seemed to hold its breath, the tension palpable. Maya knew that whatever happened next would set the tone for the rest of the encounter. She could only hope that her calm demeanor would diffuse the situation. But deep down, she knew men like Todd rarely backed down, and as she watched his hand inch closer to his holster, she realized that tonight was going to test her training in ways she hadn't expected. Todd Hale took another step closer, his boots scuffing against the pavement as he squared his shoulders toward Maya. The air around them seemed heavier now, charged with a tension that Maya could feel in her chest. She had been in countless dangerous situations, but there was something uniquely unsettling about this one. This wasn't a battlefield where the lines between allies and enemies were clear. This wasn't a calculated operation where the rules of engagement were set. This was something far murkier, a personal confrontation fueled by ego and bias, and Maya knew all too well how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. "Let me see some ID," Todd demanded, his voice sharp and clipped. His hand was still resting on his belt, just inches from his holster. It wasn't the request itself that unsettled Maya, it was the way he said it. the way his tone dripped with suspicion and authority, as if he had already decided she was guilty of something. Maya's instincts screamed at her to be careful. She had been trained to read people, to pick up on subtle cues in their body language and tone. Todd was coiled like a spring, ready to lash out at the slightest provocation. She had to tread carefully, diffuse the tension without giving him a reason to escalate. She reached into her jacket pocket slowly, deliberately, keeping her movements calm and measured. "Sure," she said evenly, pulling out her wallet. "Here's my ID." She extended the card toward him, but Todd didn't take it. Instead, he glanced at it briefly before narrowing his eyes at her. "What are you doing out here, really?" he asked, his tone laced with accusation. "You don't look like someone who just goes for a walk at this time of night." Maya's jaw tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. She had faced far worse than this, men with guns pointed at her, men who had tried to break her through intimidation and violence. Todd was just another version of the same. "I told you," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm just out for a walk. I live in the neighborhood, and I'm heading home." Todd's smirk returned, curling at the edges of his lips like a predator circling its prey. "Neighborhood, huh," he said, the skepticism in his voice almost palpable. "Which house is yours? Let's see if your story checks out." Maya felt a flicker of irritation rise in her chest, but she pushed it down. She wasn't going to let him bait her into an argument. "I don't see why that's necessary," she said firmly but politely. "I've given you my ID. I'm not breaking any laws, and I haven't done anything wrong." But Todd wasn't listening. He stepped even closer, invading her personal space, his presence looming over her like a shadow. "You think you can just stroll around here and not answer my questions?" he snapped, his tone rising. "I'm trying to keep this neighborhood safe. People like you don't make that easy." Maya's eyes narrowed ever so slightly at his words, but she kept her expression neutral. She wasn't surprised by his comment, but hearing it out loud still stung. She had heard similar sentiments before, cloaked in the same veneer of authority and righteousness. But this wasn't the time to push back. She needed to de-escalate, to regain control of the situation without giving him an excuse to act on whatever narrative he was building in his mind. "I understand you're just doing your job," she said, her voice calm but firm. "But I've already told you the truth. I'm not a threat, and I'm not causing any trouble. There's no need for this to go any further." Todd scoffed, the sound cutting through the quiet night like a knife. "Not causing trouble," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "That's exactly what someone causing trouble would say." Maya could feel the situation slipping further out of her control. Todd wasn't interested in the truth or even in maintaining the peace. He was looking for a reason, any reason, to assert his dominance, to validate the story he had already written in his head about her. And the more calmly she responded, the more it seemed to irritate him, as if her composure was a challenge to his authority. "Step over here," Todd said suddenly, gesturing toward the side of the road where his cruiser was parked. His tone was less a request and more a command, and his hand moved closer to his holster. "We're going to have a little chat, and you're going to answer my questions properly." Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing her options. She knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but she also knew that refusing to comply could escalate the situation further. She decided to play along, at least for now, and stepped toward the cruiser, keeping her movements slow and deliberate. Todd followed her closely, his eyes never leaving her, as if he were waiting for her to make a wrong move. When they reached the cruiser, he stopped and crossed his arms over his chest, his posture radiating authority. "What's in the bag?" he asked, nodding toward the small backpack slung over her shoulder. Maya tensed slightly but kept her composure. The bag contained nothing incriminating, just a water bottle, a small flashlight, and a few other essentials she carried out of habit. But she knew that Todd wouldn't see it that way. He was already suspicious of her, and the contents of the bag would only give him more fuel for his assumptions. "Just some personal items," she said simply, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. "Nothing unusual." Todd's smirk deepened, and he took a step closer. "Mind if I take a look?" he asked, though it was clear from his tone that he wasn't really asking. Maya felt a surge of frustration, but she forced herself to stay calm. She knew her rights, and she wasn't about to let him violate them. "Unless you have probable cause, I don't think that's necessary," she said evenly, meeting his gaze without flinching. Todd's smirk vanished, replaced by a scowl. He stepped even closer, his presence almost suffocating. "Listen, lady," he said, his voice low and menacing. "I don't care what you think is necessary. You're in my neighborhood, on my watch, and you're going to do what I say. Understand?" Maya's instincts kicked into overdrive. She could feel the danger radiating off him now, a volatile mix of anger and frustration that could explode at any moment. She had to think quickly to find a way to diffuse the situation without putting herself in even greater danger. "I understand," she said carefully, her tone steady but non-confrontational. "But I haven't done anything wrong, and I'm not carrying anything illegal. I'm just trying to get home." Todd didn't seem to hear her. His hand moved to his holster, his fingers brushing against the grip of his gun. "Show me the bag," he repeated, his tone hardening. Maya's heart pounded in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She had been in situations like this before, where the wrong move could mean the difference between life and death. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, and slowly began to slide the bag off her shoulder. But as she did, Todd lunged forward, grabbing her wrist with one hand while reaching for the bag with the other. His grip was tight, his fingers digging into her skin, and Maya felt a surge of anger rise within her. She tried to pull away, but Todd held firm, his strength fueled by his rage. "You think you can just walk away from me?" he snarled, his face inches from hers. "I don't think so." Maya's training kicked in instinctively. She twisted her wrist sharply, breaking his grip, and took a step back, putting some distance between them. But Todd wasn't done. He reached for his radio, his eyes blazing with fury. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice shaking with anger, "for resisting an officer." Maya's eyes narrowed as she realized the gravity of the situation. Todd wasn't going to back down, and she wasn't going to let herself be taken in for a crime she didn't commit. She had to act, and she had to act now. Todd's hand hovered over his radio, his other still brushing against the holster at his hip. His anger was palpable, his entire demeanor that of a man who felt his authority slipping away and was desperate to regain it. Maya could see it clearly now. This wasn't about her, not really. This was about his own insecurities, his need to feel powerful in a world where he likely felt powerless. But knowing that didn't make the situation any less dangerous. If anything, it heightened the stakes. A man like Todd, cornered and fueled by his own ego, was unpredictable, and unpredictable people were the most dangerous of all. "You think you're smart, don't you?" Todd spat, stepping toward her again. "You think you can just mouth off to me, ignore my authority, and walk away like this is nothing? Not on my watch." Maya didn't move, her body taut but composed, every muscle ready to react if needed. She'd seen this kind of escalation before, men whose pride drove them to irrational extremes. Her training had taught her to recognize the signs early and act decisively when the moment called for it. But there was a fine line between decisive action and provocation, and she was walking that line now. One wrong word, one wrong move, and Todd could snap in a way that left her with no choice but to escalate further. "I'm not trying to walk away," Maya said, her voice calm and steady. though her heart was pounding. "I'm just trying to de-escalate this situation. You've asked your questions, and I've answered them. I'm not a threat to you, officer. Let's both take a step back and handle this rationally." Todd let out a harsh laugh, the sound devoid of humor. "Rationally? You don't get to decide how this goes. You don't get to tell me what to do. You're going to do exactly what I say, or you're going to regret it. Do you understand me?" Maya's jaw tightened, but she didn't let her frustration show. She could feel the tension in the air thickening, like a wire stretched to its breaking point. Todd was goading her, trying to provoke her into reacting in a way that would justify whatever he planned to do next. But she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. She wouldn't let him dictate her actions. Still, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of danger, the way his hand lingered near his weapon, the way his eyes darted around, as if searching for an excuse to act. "I understand," Maya said carefully, her tone neutral. "But you need to understand that I'm not resisting you. I've complied with everything you've asked. There's no reason for this to continue." But Todd wasn't hearing her. His anger had reached a boiling point, his perception clouded by his own biases and frustrations. He stepped closer again, his chest puffed out, his stance aggressive. "You think you're clever, don't you? You think you're going to talk your way out of this?" "I don't think so." And then it happened. In a sudden burst of movement, Todd reached for her arm, his grip rough and unrelenting. Maya's body reacted instinctively, her training taking over before she could even process what was happening. She twisted her arm sharply, breaking his grip with a fluid motion, and stepped back, putting space between them. It was a controlled move, designed to diffuse rather than escalate, but Todd didn't see it that way. His face turned red with fury, and he lunged at her again, this time with both hands. Maya sidestepped smoothly, her movements precise and calculated, her body flowing like water as she evaded his grasp. But Todd was relentless. His hands lashed out wildly, his frustration fueling his aggression, and Maya realized she had no choice but to defend herself. She moved quickly, her mind a whirlwind of calculations as she assessed his movements, his posture, his weak points. As he lunged at her again, she caught his wrist with one hand and twisted it sharply, using his own momentum to throw him off balance. He stumbled, his foot catching on the curb, and fell hard onto the pavement with a grunt. But he didn't stay down for long. He scrambled to his feet, his face contorted with rage, and reached for his baton, pulling it from his belt with a sharp snap. Maya's heart raced as she saw the baton glint in the dim light. This was escalating far beyond what she had hoped to avoid. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but Todd was leaving her no choice. He swung the baton at her with a wild, reckless force, and she barely had time to dodge, the metal passing just inches from her ribs. She pivoted on her heel, her body moving with practiced precision, and countered with a quick strike to his forearm, causing him to drop the weapon with a clatter. "Stand down," Officer Maya said firmly, her voice carrying a weight of authority that cut through the tension. "You don't want to do this." But Todd wasn't listening. His pride was wounded, his anger blinding him to reason. He lunged for her again, his movements more erratic now, more desperate. Maya sidestepped once more, her hands coming up in a defensive posture. She didn't want to hurt him, but he wasn't giving her many options. As Todd swung at her again, she caught his arm mid-motion and used his own force to twist him around, locking his arm behind his back. He let out a pained grunt, struggling against her hold, but she held firm, her grip like iron. "Let go of me," Todd snarled, his voice laced with fury. "You're assaulting an officer." "You assaulted me first," Maya replied evenly, her voice calm but firm. "This stops now." Todd continued to struggle, his movements wild and frantic, but Maya's hold was unyielding. She could feel his muscles straining against her grip, his anger fueling his strength, but she had the advantage. Her training had taught her how to neutralize threats quickly and efficiently, and Todd, for all his bluster, was no match for her skills. But then he did something she hadn't anticipated. With a sudden burst of strength, he managed to twist out of her grasp and stumbled backward, reaching for his radio. His hand fumbled with the device, his fingers trembling with a mix of rage and desperation. "This is Officer Hale," he barked into the radio, his voice shaky but defiant. "I need backup. Suspect is resisting arrest and assaulting an officer." Maya's stomach sank as she heard the words. She knew how this would look, how his version of events would paint her as the aggressor. She had to act quickly, to regain control of the situation before it spiraled any further out of hand. "Todd," she said, her voice firm but calm, "think about what you're doing. You know this isn't the truth. Put the radio down, and we can talk this out." But Todd wasn't listening. His face was a mask of fury, his breath coming in heavy gasps. He reached for his baton again, his movements frantic, and Maya realized she had no choice. She moved swiftly, her body a blur of motion as she closed the distance between them. Before Todd could react, she kicked the baton out of his hand, the weapon skittering across the pavement. She followed up with a precise strike to his shoulder, forcing him to drop the radio as he staggered back. Todd let out a roar of frustration, his hands clenching into fists as he charged at her again. Maya sidestepped smoothly, her foot sweeping out to catch his ankle and send him tumbling to the ground once more. This time, she didn't give him the chance to recover. She moved quickly, pinning him to the ground with a firm but controlled hold, her knee pressing lightly against his back to keep him in place. "Stay down," she said sharply, her voice leaving no room for argument. "This is over." Todd struggled beneath her, his breaths coming in ragged gasps, but he couldn't break free. His pride had led him here, and now he was at her mercy. For a moment, the only sound was the heavy breathing of both combatants, the tension hanging thick in the air. Maya knew this wasn't the end. The backup he had called for would be on its way, and when they arrived, she would have to explain everything. But for now, she had neutralized the threat. Todd was no longer in control, and she had ensured her own safety. Still, the weight of what had just transpired pressed heavily on her, a reminder of the fine line she had walked and would continue to walk in a world that often refused to see her for who she truly was. Maya's heart pounded as she maintained her position, kneeling on Todd's back to keep him immobilized. His ragged breathing and muttered curses underscored his frustration, but she couldn't allow herself the luxury of distraction. Every second counted. Backup would be here soon, and Maya knew that whatever story Todd spun into the radio would shape how the arriving officers perceived the situation. She had managed to de-escalate similar situations in the past, but the stakes had never felt this personal or this precarious. It wasn't just about proving her innocence or asserting her side of the story. It was about survival. Todd shifted beneath her, still trying to squirm free, his movements jerky and erratic. "Get off me," he spat through gritted teeth. His voice was hoarse from exertion, but there was no sign of him giving up. "You're done for, you hear me? You don't touch a cop and walk away." Maya leaned forward slightly, applying just enough pressure to keep him pinned without causing harm. Her calm tone belied the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Stop struggling, Officer Hale. This can end right here if you stay still. Nobody needs to get hurt." Todd snarled in response, his pride clearly more bruised than his body. Maya could feel the heat of his anger radiating from him like a furnace. He wasn't listening. Men like him rarely did when they were pushed to this point. She quickly scanned the street around her, assessing her environment for potential threats or witnesses. The road was still quiet, the distant hum of traffic from a nearby highway the only sound beyond Todd's labored breaths. For now, they were alone. The radio Todd had dropped lay a few feet away, crackling faintly with static. Maya knew she needed to act fast. If she didn't secure it, Todd's earlier transmission would ensure that reinforcements arrived with an expectation of hostility. She reached out with her free hand, her fingers brushing against the cold plastic as she pulled it closer. She quickly turned the volume down to silence its incessant crackle. The last thing she needed was more noise adding to the tension. As she did, Todd seized the moment to twist violently beneath her, nearly throwing her off balance. Maya reacted instinctively, shifting her weight to keep him pinned while maintaining her composure. "Stop resisting," she commanded sharply, her voice taking on the clipped authority she'd learned during her CIA training. "You're making this worse for yourself." "You think you're in charge here," Todd growled, his voice dripping with venom. "You have no idea who you're messing with. Backup's coming, and when they get here, you're going to wish you'd never set foot in this neighborhood." Maya ignored the threat, her mind racing through possible outcomes. She couldn't afford to let Todd regain the upper hand, but she also couldn't be seen as the aggressor when more officers arrived. The optics of the situation were already stacked against her, a lone black woman pinning a white police officer to the ground in a quiet suburban street. She could imagine how the scene would look to someone arriving mid-conflict without context. The weight of that reality pressed on her like a vice. Todd's words suddenly shifted, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're just another nobody who thought you could push back against the law. I've dealt with your kind before. You don't scare me." Maya's patience wore thin, but she held her tongue. His words were meant to provoke, to push her into making a mistake that would validate his version of events. She wasn't going to fall for it. Instead, she focused on her breathing, slowing her heart rate and keeping her grip steady. Her training had taught her that control of both the situation and herself was the most powerful weapon she had. The distant sound of a siren shattered the tense silence, its wail cutting through the night like a blade. Todd's head jerked up slightly, a cruel smirk spreading across his face. "Hear that? That's your ticket to a holding cell. When they get here, you're done." Maya's jaw tightened. The approaching sirens meant she had mere moments to prepare. She knew she needed to establish control over the narrative before the reinforcements arrived. Todd's smug satisfaction only reinforced her determination. She couldn't let his lies shape the course of what happened next. She leaned closer, lowering her voice so only he could hear. "You've already crossed the line, Officer Hale. If you keep pushing, you're going to make things even worse for yourself. I suggest you think very carefully about what you say when backup gets here." Todd twisted his neck to glare at her, his smirk faltering for the first time. "You threatening me now? You're going to regret this, lady. You think your little self-defense act is going to fly when the cavalry shows up?" Maya didn't respond. She couldn't waste energy on his taunts. Instead, she adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she could disengage quickly if necessary. The sirens grew louder, the flashing lights of an approaching patrol car casting long, shifting shadows against the buildings lining the street. She released her hold on Todd just enough to step back, raising her hands slowly to show she wasn't a threat. The last thing she needed was for the arriving officers to misinterpret her actions. The cruiser screeched to a halt a few yards away, its doors flying open as two officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their weapons. "What's going on here?" one of them barked, his eyes darting between Maya and Todd. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. He was ready to draw his weapon at the slightest provocation. Maya kept her hands raised, her voice calm but firm. Officer Hale initiated an unwarranted confrontation and escalated it physically. I defended myself. He's unharmed, but I had no choice but to restrain him. The second officer, a younger man with sharp eyes, looked down at Todd, who was still sprawled on the ground. "Hale, you okay?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. Todd groaned as he sat up, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "She assaulted me," he spat, pointing a finger at Maya. "She refused to comply, resisted arrest, and attacked me. Cuff her." Maya's stomach churned at the blatant distortion of the truth, but she forced herself to stay composed. She turned her attention to the younger officer, meeting his gaze directly. "I didn't resist. I didn't assault him. Check the radio logs. He called for backup after I defended myself from his aggression. You'll see the timeline doesn't match his story." The older officer glanced between Maya and Todd, his brow furrowing as he processed the conflicting accounts. "Hale, what were you doing out here in the first place? Was there a call or something?" Todd hesitated for a fraction of a second, and Maya didn't miss the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "There have been reports of suspicious activity in the area," he said, his voice defensive. She fit the description. The younger officer frowned. "What description? Dispatch didn't mention anything about a suspect tonight." Todd's face reddened, and he scrambled to recover. "I saw her acting suspiciously. I made the call. I don't need dispatch to tell me when something's off." Maya seized the moment, her voice steady and authoritative. "He targeted me without cause. When I asked what I'd done wrong, he escalated to physical aggression. I acted in self-defense." The older officer raised a hand to silence them both, his expression unreadable. "All right, enough. Jenkins, you stay right where you are. Hale, get up and stand by the cruiser." Todd shot Maya a venomous glare as he staggered to his feet, brushing dirt from his uniform. Maya watched him closely, her senses on high alert. She could see the gears turning in his head, his desperation to regain control of the situation. But for the first time, he seemed to realize he was on shaky ground. The older officer pulled out his radio, speaking into it quietly as he requested additional information. The younger officer approached Maya cautiously, his posture less tense than before. He said carefully, "Do you have any identification?" Maya nodded, keeping her movements slow as she reached for her pocket. "I do. I'm willing to cooperate fully." As she handed over her ID, the officer studied it, his eyes widening slightly as he read her credentials. "CIA," he muttered under his breath, his gaze snapping back to her. "You're with the agency." Maya inclined her head slightly. "I am. And I'd prefer to handle this quietly and professionally." The officer's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and uncertainty crossing his face. He stepped back, handing her ID to the older officer, who raised an eyebrow as he read it. "Well," the older man said slowly, "this just got a lot more complicated." The tension between Maya, Todd, and the two arriving officers hung thick in the air like an impending storm. Maya's composed demeanor, despite the escalating situation, only made the officers more cautious. The older officer, who appeared to be in charge, examined her IDN, his brows furrowed as he processed the unexpected revelation. CIA credentials weren't something he encountered often, let alone in the middle of a quiet suburban neighborhood during a routine patrol. Todd, on the other hand, had no such hesitation. The sight of Maya's credentials didn't give him pause. Instead, it seemed to fuel his rage. His face flushed red, his breathing ragged, and his fists clenched at his sides. For Todd, this wasn't just a confrontation, it was a challenge to his authority, and Maya's calmness only stoked the fire of his anger. "You're not seriously going to believe this," Todd barked, pointing an accusatory finger at Maya. "She attacked me. She's dangerous, and she's lying about who she is." The younger officer, whose name tag read Carlson, looked at Todd with a mix of skepticism and unease. "Hale, calm down," he said, his voice measured but firm. "You need to step back and let us handle this." "Step back," Todd snapped, his voice rising. "I'm the one who called this in. She's the suspect here, not me." "What, you're just going to take her word for it?" Carlson turned to the older officer, clearly seeking guidance. The older man, whose name tag read Mitchell, rubbed the bridge of his nose, clearly frustrated. "Hale, I'm trying to piece together what happened here," Mitchell said, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "But you need to cool off. You're not helping your case by shouting and pointing fingers." "I don't need to help my case," Todd shot back. "She's the one who assaulted me. Arrest her." Maya stood silently, watching the exchange with the same measured calm she'd maintained throughout the encounter. She could see Todd unraveling, his composure completely gone. His desperation to control the narrative was obvious, and she knew that desperation made him even more dangerous. He wasn't thinking rationally, he was lashing out, trying to salvage his ego and his position. Mitchell turned to Maya, his gaze scrutinizing but not overtly hostile. "Ma'am," he said, his tone more neutral now, "can you explain exactly what happened here? Start from the beginning." Maya nodded, her voice calm and precise as she recounted the events. She detailed how Todd had approached her without cause, how he had escalated the situation with aggressive behavior, and how she had been forced to defend herself when he grabbed her. She didn't embellish or overstate, she simply laid out the facts as they had happened. When she finished, Mitchell nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "And you're saying you only used force in self-defense?" he asked. "Yes," Maya replied firmly. "I made every effort to de-escalate the situation before it came to that point. I only acted to protect myself when Officer Hale became physically aggressive." Mitchell studied her for a moment longer before turning back to Todd. "Hale, is there anything you'd like to add?" Todd's face contorted with fury, his hands gesturing wildly as he tried to defend himself. "She's lying," he shouted. "I approached her because she was acting suspiciously, and she resisted from the start. She's just trying to twist this around to make herself look like the victim." Mitchell held up a hand, cutting him off. "Enough, Hale." "I've heard enough for now." His voice was sharp, and Todd visibly bristled at the reprimand. Carlson, who had been quiet up until now, stepped forward, his gaze flicking between Maya and Todd. "Sir, maybe we should call the watch," Commander Carlson suggested. "This is bigger than what we're equipped to handle out here." Mitchell nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. "Agreed." "Carlson, make the call." He glanced at Maya. "In the meantime, ma'am, I'd like you to stay here while we sort this out. We'll need to confirm your credentials and get a full account of what happened." "Of course," Maya said evenly. She wasn't surprised by the request. She knew the situation was delicate, and she was willing to cooperate fully to ensure the truth came out. Carlson stepped away to make the call, leaving Mitchell, Todd, and Maya standing in tense silence. Todd's glare burned into Maya, his fury practically vibrating off him. Mitchell seemed to sense the growing hostility and stepped between them, his posture firm. "Hale, go stand by the car," Mitchell ordered. "That's not a suggestion." Todd looked like he was about to argue, but something in Mitchell's tone made him think better of it. With a muttered curse, he stomped back to the cruiser, his movements jerky and aggressive. Maya watched him go, her senses still on high alert. She knew better than to assume the danger had passed. Todd wasn't the type to back down, and she had no doubt he was already scheming his next move. The sound of approaching sirens broke the tension, drawing everyone's attention. A second cruiser pulled up, its lights flashing as two more officers stepped out. One was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a commanding presence, clearly the watch commander Carlson had called. The other was a younger woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. The watch commander introduced himself as Lieutenant Daniels, his tone calm but firm as he approached. He quickly took stock of the situation, his gaze moving from Maya to Todd to Mitchell. "All right, let's get this sorted out," Daniels said. "Mitchell, what do we have here?" Mitchell quickly summarized the events as he understood them, emphasizing that there were conflicting accounts and that Maya had presented CIA credentials. Daniels listened carefully, his expression giving nothing away. When Mitchell finished, Daniels turned to Maya. "Ms. Jenkins," Daniels said, his tone measured, "I understand this has been a tense situation, but I need to confirm your credentials and get your side of the story." Maya handed over her ID without hesitation. "Of course, Lieutenant. I'm happy to cooperate." Daniels examined the ID closely before handing it back, his demeanor shifting slightly as he addressed her. "Your credentials check out," he said. "But I still need to understand what led to this confrontation." Maya recounted the events once again, her tone calm and professional. She emphasized that she had only acted in self-defense and that she had tried repeatedly to de-escalate the situation. Daniels listened intently, nodding occasionally as she spoke. When she finished, Daniels turned to Todd, his expression hardening. "Hale, I need your version of events." Todd launched into his story, his voice loud and defensive as he tried to paint Maya as the aggressor. But his account was filled with inconsistencies, and Daniels's sharp gaze didn't miss a single one. The more Todd talked, the more his credibility seemed to crumble. When Todd finally finished, Daniels folded his arms across his chest, his expression stern. "Hale, based on what I've heard so far, it sounds like you escalated this situation unnecessarily. That's not how we operate." Todd's face turned an even deeper shade of red. "You're taking her side," he demanded, his voice rising. "She's lying. She attacked me." Daniels didn't flinch. "I'm not taking sides," he said firmly. "I'm following the facts, and the facts suggest that you acted inappropriately." Todd opened his mouth to argue, but Daniels cut him off with a sharp gesture. "Enough, Hale. This is going to internal affairs for review. Until then, you're relieved of duty." The words hit Todd like a physical blow. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. Maya watched him carefully, ready to react if he made another move. But Todd seemed frozen, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. Daniels turned back to Maya, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Jenkins, I appreciate your cooperation. I understand this has been a difficult situation, and I want to assure you that we'll conduct a full investigation. If there's anything else you'd like to add, now is the time." Maya shook her head. "I've said everything I need to. Thank you for handling this professionally." Daniels nodded, his respect for her evident in his posture. "We'll be in touch. In the meantime, if you feel unsafe or have any concerns, don't hesitate to contact us." As the officers began to disperse, Todd stood by the cruiser, his face a mask of seething rage. Maya could feel his glare burning into her back as she walked away, but she didn't look back. She had won this battle, but she knew the war wasn't over. Men like Todd didn't let go of their grudges easily, and she had no doubt he would find a way to lash out again. But for now, she focused on what mattered: getting home safely and ensuring that the truth of what happened tonight would come to light. The quiet of the night had returned, but the tension lingered like an unspoken threat. Maya walked away from the scene, her steps steady but her mind racing. The confrontation with Todd hadn't broken her composure, but it had ignited something deep within her, a simmering anger at the system that allowed men like him to thrive. As she approached the small house she was renting, she could still feel the weight of his glare from across the street, even though she hadn't looked back. She had faced enemies in war zones, adversaries armed with weapons and hatred, but tonight's battle felt different. It was a reminder that no amount of training or experience could fully shield her from the prejudices embedded in her own country. When Maya reached her doorstep, she paused, her hand resting on the doorknob as she glanced back at the street. The flashing lights of the patrol cars were gone now, leaving the neighborhood shrouded in an eerie stillness. She knew this wasn't the end. Todd's anger was too volatile, his need for control too consuming. He would find a way to retaliate, whether through formal complaints, back-channel accusations, or something even more reckless. Men like him rarely let go of their grievances quietly. As she stepped inside and locked the door behind her, Maya felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease, though the knot in her stomach remained. She placed her bag on the counter and sat down at the small kitchen table, her mind replaying every detail of the night. She knew the situation would escalate further, but this time it wouldn't be on the streets. Todd's claims and her actions would now be scrutinized by a system that often prioritized the word of an officer over the truth. The thought was exhausting, but Maya wasn't one to back down from a fight, especially one that was so deeply personal. She reached for her phone and dialed a secure number, one that connected her directly to her handler at the CIA. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Jenkins, the voice said, calm and professional. "What's the situation?" Maya took a deep breath before responding. "There's been an incident," she said, keeping her tone measured. "Local law enforcement. I had to defend myself against an officer who escalated a routine interaction." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and Maya could almost hear the gears turning in her handler's mind. "Are you okay?" he finally asked. "I'm fine," she replied. "But the officer called for backup, and now it's being investigated. My credentials have been verified, but this isn't going to go away quietly. The officer in question, he's volatile. I don't trust him to handle this professionally." Another pause, and then her handler's tone shifted, taking on a more cautious edge. "Do you need intervention?" Maya shook her head, even though he couldn't see her. "Not yet. I want to let the local process play out, but I need you to monitor it. If it looks like they're trying to twist the narrative, I'll need support." "Understood," her handler said. "We'll keep an eye on it. Let me know if anything changes." Maya ended the call and leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She didn't like involving her agency in personal matters, but she also knew that Todd wouldn't stop until he felt vindicated. She needed to be prepared for whatever came next. The next morning, Maya woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. She reached for it groggily, squinting at the screen. It was a local number, one she didn't recognize. Her gut tightened as she answered. "Hello." "MS." Jenkins, a woman's voice asked, brisk and professional. "This is Lieutenant Daniels from the precinct. I wanted to give you an update on last night's incident." Maya sat up, her mind immediately alert. "I'm listening." "We've reviewed the initial reports, including Officer Hale's statements and the information you provided," Daniels continued. "Internal Affairs has already been notified, and they've started their investigation. However, I should warn you that Hale is claiming you assaulted him without provocation. He's pushing for charges." Maya felt a flicker of frustration but kept her tone even. "And what does the evidence say?" Daniels hesitated briefly before responding. "Your credentials and account carry significant weight, and there are inconsistencies in Hale's version of events. That said, his accusations complicate things. This is going to take time to resolve." Maya nodded, even though Daniels couldn't see her. "Understood. I'm prepared to cooperate fully." "Good," Daniels said. One more thing. I suggest being cautious in the meantime. Hale. Well, let's just say he's not taking this well. He's already been suspended, but that hasn't stopped him from making noise. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. Thanks for the warning. After hanging up, Maya sat in silence for a moment, her mind racing. Todd's retaliation was already underway, and she knew it wouldn't stop with formal complaints. Men like him didn't just go quietly. She had seen it before, people who couldn't accept accountability, who lashed out at anyone they perceived as a threat to their fragile sense of power. But Maya wasn't one to be intimidated. If Todd wanted a fight, she was more than ready. As the day wore on, Maya stayed vigilant. She kept her movements deliberate, her senses sharp, knowing that Todd might try something reckless. And her instincts were right. That evening, as she returned from a run, she noticed a car parked a few houses down from hers. It was an unmarked vehicle, but the figure inside was unmistakable. Todd. His face was partially obscured by the reflection on the windshield, but she could see the anger in his posture, the way his hands gripped the steering wheel. Maya didn't break stride, but her mind worked quickly. Todd wasn't here on official business. He couldn't be, not while suspended. This was personal, and personal meant unpredictable. She walked up her driveway and entered her house, locking the door behind her. From the corner of the window, she watched as Todd's car remained stationary, its engine idling. He was watching, waiting for something. Maya considered her options. She could call the precinct and report his presence, but that might only escalate the situation further. Instead, she decided to confront him on her terms. She stepped into her kitchen, grabbed a glass of water, and took a moment to calm herself. When she returned to the front door, Todd's car was still there, his figure unmoving. Without hesitation, Maya stepped outside, her posture calm but purposeful. She walked toward his car, her steps slow and deliberate. When she reached the driver's side, she tapped lightly on the window. Todd startled slightly, his eyes darting toward her before he rolled the window down just enough to speak. "Is there something you need?" Officer Hale, Maya asked, her tone steady but firm. Todd's jaw tightened, and his knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. "I'm just here to make sure everything's in order," he said, his voice laced with barely contained hostility. Maya raised an eyebrow. "You're suspended, aren't you? This doesn't seem like official police business." Todd's face reddened, and for a moment he didn't respond. Then, with a sneer, he said, "You think you've won, don't you? You think flashing that fancy badge makes you untouchable. But people like you don't belong here. I'm not going to let you get away with what you did." Maya's gaze hardened, and her voice dropped to a deadly calm. "You're on dangerous ground, Todd. You've already crossed lines that are going to cost you your career. Keep pushing, and you'll lose a lot more than that." Todd laughed bitterly, though there was no humor in it. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," Maya said. "You've already lost control of this situation. The more you dig, the deeper the hole gets. Walk away now, while you still can." Todd stared at her, his expression flickering between rage and uncertainty. For a moment it seemed like he might lash out, but then he looked away, his hands trembling on the wheel. Without another word, he rolled up the window and drove off, his tires squealing as he sped down the street. Maya stood in the driveway, watching him disappear into the night. She knew this wasn't over, but she also knew she had sent a clear message. Todd could try to fight her, but she wasn't afraid. Whatever came next, she would be ready. The days following the confrontation with Todd were anything but quiet. Maya's life shifted into a tense waiting game, the kind she had grown all too familiar with during her time in the CIA. Only this time it wasn't about gathering intelligence or waiting for an opportune moment to strike. It was about surviving the fallout of an encounter that could have ended far worse. She had faced trained enemies and walked out unscathed, but here, in the country she had sworn to protect, the battle was more insidious. It wasn't just physical, it was systemic, and it felt personal. The investigation into Todd Hale's actions moved quickly. Lieutenant Daniels had assured her that Internal Affairs was taking the matter seriously, and Maya provided her full account with unwavering precision. She outlined every detail of Todd's actions, from his unprovoked aggression to his attempts to escalate the situation. Daniels had listened intently, his demeanor professional but tinged with a hint of guilt, as though the weight of representing a flawed system sat heavily on his shoulders. Despite the assurances, Maya remained skeptical. She knew how often these cases ended with a slap on the wrist or, worse, no consequences at all. She had seen men like Todd slip through the cracks too many times. They weren't anomalies, they were products of a system that not only allowed bias to fester but actively protected it. Still, she cooperated fully, knowing that every word she provided, every fact she recounted, could be the difference between justice and yet another cover-up. 3 days after the incident, Maya received a call from Daniels. She was at her kitchen table, scrolling through updates on her tablet, when her phone buzzed. The precinct number flashed on the screen, and she answered immediately. MS. Jenkins. Daniels began, his tone cautious. I wanted to let you know that we've completed the initial phase of the investigation. And Maya asked, keeping her voice calm, despite the churn of anxiety in her chest. And Officer Hale has been officially suspended without pay pending further review, Daniels said. Internal Affairs has found enough evidence of misconduct to proceed with formal disciplinary action. They're recommending termination. Maya leaned back in her chair, letting the words sink in. It was progress, but it wasn't enough. Todd losing his job didn't erase the danger he posed or the harm he had already done. Still, it was a step in the right direction. What happens next? She asked. Next, the department will convene a disciplinary hearing, Daniels explained. And depending on the outcome, Hale may face criminal charges for his actions that night. The DA is already looking into the case. Maya nodded, even though he couldn't see her. And what about me? Am I expected to testify? Possibly, Daniels said. But for now, we just need you to remain available. Your cooperation has been invaluable, and I want to thank you for staying professional through all of this. Maya's lips tightened. Professionalism was second nature to her, but it didn't mean she wasn't angry. I hope the department understands the gravity of this, she said, her voice firm. Hale's actions were more than misconduct, they were dangerous. If this isn't handled properly, it sets a precedent that puts more lives at risk. Daniels hesitated before responding. I understand your concerns, he said. And I promise you this is being taken seriously. After the call ended, Maya sat in silence, her mind racing. She wanted to believe Daniels, wanted to trust that the system would work as intended. But her experience told her otherwise. The system was designed to protect itself, to shield its own from accountability. And Todd was the kind of man who would use every tool at his disposal to fight back. Her thoughts were interrupted by another buzz from her phone, a message from her CIA handler. It was brief and to the point: update on Hale, Iowa recommends termination. Monitoring situation. Notify if threats escalate. Maya appreciated the agency's vigilance, even if she preferred to handle this on her own. They knew she was more than capable, but they also understood the risks she faced. Over the next week, the community began to stir. Word of the incident had spread, though not through the usual channels of media and public outcry. Instead, it circulated quietly, neighbors talking over fences, colleagues murmuring in break rooms. Maya could feel the weight of their stares when she walked through the neighborhood, some curious, others judgmental. She didn't care. She had faced scrutiny before, and she wasn't about to let it deter her now. Todd, however, was another story. Though he had been suspended, he hadn't gone quietly. He had filed a formal complaint against Maya, accusing her of assault and obstruction. It was a desperate move, one that Maya suspected was less about clearing his name and more about retaliation. She prepared herself for the possibility of a legal battle, consulting with the CIA's legal team to ensure she was protected. Then, one evening, as she sat reviewing documents related to the case, her doorbell rang. Maya's muscles tensed instinctively, and she moved to the door with quiet precision, peering through the peephole. To her surprise, it wasn't Todd or anyone from the precinct. It was a young woman, early 20s, dressed in casual clothes and holding a notebook. Maya hesitated before opening the door. "Can I help you?" Maya asked, her tone neutral. The woman smiled nervously. "Hi, Miss Jenkins. My name is Laura, and I'm with a local community group. We heard about what happened with Officer Hale, and we wanted to reach out. Is it okay if I talk to you for a moment?" Maya frowned slightly but nodded, stepping outside to join the woman on the porch. "What kind of community group?" she asked. "We focus on police accountability and systemic reform," Laura explained. "We've been following cases like yours, and we think your story could help shine a light on what's happening in law enforcement. People need to know about this." Maya crossed her arms, her mind racing. She appreciated the sentiment, but the last thing she wanted was to become a public figure in this fight. Her work required discretion, and she couldn't risk exposing herself further. "I appreciate what you're trying to do," Maya said carefully, "but I'm not sure going public is the right move for me." Laura nodded, her expression understanding. "I get that, and we're not here to pressure you. But if you ever change your mind, we'd love to help amplify your voice. People are starting to pay attention, and your experience could make a real difference." After Laura left, Maya sat on her porch, staring out at the darkening street. She thought about the young woman's words, about the idea of turning her personal ordeal into a larger fight for justice. It was tempting, but it wasn't her way. Maya had always operated behind the scenes, pulling strings where they couldn't be seen, influencing outcomes without drawing attention. She wasn't ready to change that now. In the weeks that followed, the disciplinary hearing concluded with Todd's termination. Internal Affairs released a scathing report detailing his history of misconduct, painting a clear picture of a man who had no place in law enforcement. Maya felt a sense of vindication, but it was tempered by the knowledge that Todd was just one man in a much larger system. His firing was a victory, but it wasn't the end of the fight. One evening, as Maya prepared to leave for a rare night out, her phone buzzed with another message from her handler. Case closed. Hale terminated. Continue monitoring local climate. Reach out if needed. Maya read the words and exhaled slowly. The immediate danger was gone, but the battle for systemic change was far from over. As she locked her door and stepped into the cool night air, Maya reflected on everything that had happened. She had faced a man who embodied the worst of the system, and she had emerged victorious. But the scars of the experience lingered, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done. She wasn't ready to step into the spotlight, but she wasn't about to walk away from the fight either. Maya smiled faintly to herself as she walked down the street. Her battles had always been fought in the shadows, and that's where she was most comfortable. But now she carried something new with her, a quiet resolve to ensure that men like Todd Hale would no longer be able to operate unchecked. Whether in the shadows or the light, she was ready for whatever came next.